Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to review a book entitled The Brain, the Mind, and the Person Within by Mark Cosgrove. And we have with us today Michael Huntz, pastor of Pleasant View Bible Church here in Warsaw, Indiana. And he's going to share some an overview and some insights that he has gleaned from this book by Mark Cosgrove. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Herb.
Well, tell us a little something about the book by maybe sharing a little something about the thesis of the book. What's the thesis? Where is Mark Cosgrove going with this book?
So Mark is a professor of psychology at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana, and he is writing in part from an apologetic standpoint, from a Christian perspective and worldview, looking at the broader issue of the relationship between the physical brain and the mind, the person within that brain. And so he explores a lot of current issues in neuroscience and understanding of the anatomy of the brain and its relationship to things that we do, thoughts, speech, even religious thinking. And there's been some recent, even in the secular world, recent discussion about the God spot in the brain that might be responsible for religious thought and such. And so, there's one chapter where he delves into that and trying to understand that. So, I think his primary thesis of the book is to refute or to at least push back against the current secular view of man that sees us as matter only. The materialist, secular materialist, has no room for a spirit or a soul or something outside of matter. And so their assumptions within neuroscience is that the brain physically is responsible for everything that we feel and do, and they tend to discount the experiential aspect that almost all of us would say, there's a me beyond just my physical brain. There's a real person here. There's a soul, whatever somebody might call it. And so his purpose is to refute that materialistic notion and to present the evidence for a soul, a mind.
Okay. What are some of the issues that he covers? How does the book unfold? Does he divide the book up into sections? Is it basically chapter by chapter? How does the book unfold to develop his thesis?
Each chapter kind of relates back to that central thesis in one sense or another. I would say I didn't sense a very clear line of argument. It wasn't sort of inductive or deductive. It didn't have a trajectory to it. It was more, each chapter was a different topic that relates to the broader question of the brain, neuroscience, and the question of the soul. But he starts out, I would describe the first couple chapters as pretty technical for the non-biologist, if you've not studied the brain, and he kind of talks about the different parts of the brain and what they're responsible for, and our limited understanding of how those parts work together. So just trying to describe the idea of how the brain works. And so there's a lot of big words that are used that I don't remember. In the course of reading it, you'd see that word and you'd try to process it and it'd come up later in the chapter. And there's just enough of those sorts of anatomical words that I didn't click with. But I think what I took from those first few chapters is more or less, there's more that we don't know. There's more that scientists don't know about the brain than that they do know. I didn't come prepared to articulate the specifics of this point, but at one point he talks about attempts to map the circuitry of the brain, and something like, it's going to take them about 10 years with, I forget how many dozens or even hundreds of researchers to map like 1 square millimeter of the brain. It's that complex, and that their goal is to eventually map the circuitry of the entire brain to really increase their understanding of it. But unless the way they go about it changes, that's a long time down the road. So he talks about the complexity of the brain. He goes in then in some other chapters, not necessarily in this order, but he talks about the question of personhood. What is personhood? What is the soul? What are the presuppositions behind researchers today that cause them to dismiss what most of us assume intuitively by experience, that there is a soul, and why are they quick to dismiss that as an illusion of sorts, that it's really just circuitry firing off and chemicals reacting in the brain, and there really isn't a spirit or anything there. So he talks a bit about personhood and why that's important. One chapter he talks about technological advancements in neuroscience and how some things that are probably on the horizon based on current experiments and such as it relates to technology and things that will soon be probably available. So those are some things that I remember specifically that he deals with.
Okay. What spurred you on to read this book? What caused you to want to sit and read about the brain, the mind, and the person within?
For the past couple of years, the whole area of apologetics has been sort of a growing interest in me. And particularly because as I reflected on culturally how many young people would go off to a secular university or just would grow up and leave the home, and within a couple of years they totally questioned their faith. They had become convinced that there wasn't an adequate reason to accept the Christian faith. Caused me to really feel like, boy, as a church, if we're going to be relevant in our culture today, if we're going to be meeting the practical needs, there is a significantly growing need for us to be eloquent in articulating, understanding issues related to apologetics. So I've come across some other books that have touched on, a couple years ago was the first time I was reading a chapter in a book on Christian apologetics, and it raised the fact that, secular scientists today reject the whole notion of a soul or personhood or free will on the basis of their materialistic presuppositions. And so that was the first time I was really considering all of the implications to that. And so when I came across this book, I thought it would really help to reinforce some of my own thinking and understanding of many of those issues. So.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, because I have served as a chaplain, and I did have to wrestle with the soul. When does it leave the body? What is it when a person is brain dead? And does he deal with any of that type of thing for a pastor who might be doing chaplain work? Does he engage in the soul and its presence, and when it does and doesn't leave the body? When does the body develop a soul? Does he engage in that you can remember?
Not directly.
Okay.
He does deal with the question of personhood and sanctity of human life as it relates to the soul and a person, but from what I can remember, he specifically deals with that from the perspective of when we're dealing with people who are severely mentally disabled in some way, brain damaged from an accident. There's several test cases. He calls them persons of interest, where he'll it's almost like not an appendix, but kind of like a side. Here's a case to consider, and he'll, one instance was an individual who, for whatever reason, had no short-term memory any longer, and so he lived his life in the eternal present. Wow. So he couldn't build relationships. You couldn't, you couldn't interact with him and have there be any sense of memory after a minute or two has passed. And so, his value as a human being, what are the implications of his value if he can no longer learn, no longer interact? Or, the Alzheimer's patient, the person with autism who has an inability to relate to other people because of that. What is their value as a person? And so, from a Christian perspective, if we believe that personhood is defined as the breath of God in them, then a person's value does not come from what they can do or what they know or what they can learn or how they can contribute to other people's lives. Their value is based in that they have the fingerprint of God on them, that He created them, that He loves them, and that they still reflect Him in some way. All of us reflect God in an impartial, imperfect, corrupted way from sin. Some people's minds are more corrupted than others. So he did have, I don't even know if it was a whole chapter, but he dealt with that question, which is certainly practically important for pastors, chaplains, people dealing with, folks who even just in old age, whose minds begin to fail or who are unable to do what they used to do and struggle with their own value as a human being. I think there's some practical stuff in there for that.
What did you think was the most insightful part of the book? When you think about the book as a whole, what did you find that kind of stood out and said, wow, I didn't know that? Did you have any of those wow moments when you were reading this book?
Well, the most fascinating chapter to me was a chapter on some of the technological advances in neuroscience and how they relate to what's on the horizon of what we might be able to do in the near future. So, he talked about sort of the melding together of computer and mind, and the ability to experiments related to recording thoughts, implanting thoughts from another person into a person, how that gets into communicating mind to mind through the aid of computers. There's an experiment where they have been successful in implanting, I think it was in mice, but memories from other mice into mice, and they were able to do things that they never learned themselves. I believe it had to do with running through mazes and things. And he pretty much just asked the questions. What does that imply about learning down the road? Are we going to be able to have microchips implanted in our minds? Are we going to be able to download whole languages to where we just know them, or at least can pull up words from another language at will if we're going to travel? He talks about the use of limbs that are controlled by the mind. So a person who's lost a leg has a bionic leg put on and attached to the nerves and the nerve cells that remained, and a person being able to move that bionic leg just by thoughts is something that they've been able to do. Other treatments, medical treatments, paralyzed persons being able to move cursors on a screen or computers, or again limbs through some sort of a cap that's put on the head that's attached to the brain, and so just by thought being able to control a computer or such. Just a lot of stuff like that, just kind of reading it thinking, wow, that stuff I never would have imagined could be possible. He talked about some Japanese researchers who are able to have a live rough sketch, he called it, of what a person's dreaming. So kind of taking whatever's going on in the brain and translating it into a very rough sketch of a dream of some sort, of their thoughts on a screen that he anticipates will get clearer with time. And so, the implications of all of that, he did talk some about the ethics in all of that. There's some things here that we're going to have to be careful about. Just because we can, should we? And he talked a little bit about even some of the ethics already that play into, for instance, taking human neurons in the brain and injecting them in an animal. And as a result, that animal is far more intelligent than its counterparts. And there are already restrictions on, I believe it's like no more than 10%, or I forget what the number is, of an animal's brain is allowed to be, whatever you want to call that, injected to have a more human-like thought process. But just talking about the ethics of all of that, I think is pretty important from a Christian perspective. That just because we might be able to do it one day doesn't mean we should. Or as Christians, should we embrace it? Should we fight it?
If Mark were to drive up from Taylor University and sit here with us and to talk about this book, what would be a question you might like to ask Mark? Is there something in the book you wish he had covered that perhaps he didn't?
Yeah, I think, the one thing that I was anticipating or somewhat hopeful of, a tad disappointed that it didn't get incorporated in, is the experiences of either out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences. There's been quite a bit written about that, and it seems to factor into the, I'll say scientific, but at least experiential consideration for an immaterial soul separate and distinct from the physical body. And so I was kind of hopeful that I would get his take on that he would share some examples from his research as a psychiatrist and his thoughts on all of that. I mean, is this wacky? Is this legit? And are there concerns in that area that we should be aware of? Or so he doesn't really touch on any sort of out-of-body experiential reportings at all in this book, and that would have been nice, maybe.
Okay. Are there any other books like this out there? I mean, when you think about, you spoke about apologetics and how this kind of spurred you on to want to read this. Have you come across a book like this before, or is this a book that's just kind of unique and kind of a standalone type of work?
There are some generic books on apologetics, and by generic I mean they kind of just give you an introduction to various themes related to apologetic discussions today, and they'll have a chapter on the question of, does man have a soul? And what is personhood? What is free will? Some of those hot button questions. The only other book that I've come across, there's probably others, but I've read a book a couple years ago by Dinesh D'Souza entitled Life After Death, The Evidence. And he touches on a lot of similar issues related to neuroscience and the brain and the relationship between the physical brain and the mind or the soul. And so there's a lot of overlap. He doesn't. There's also quite a bit of things that both of those, this book and Dinesh D'Souza's book, touch on that the other doesn't. But there's a bit of overlap, and they both are, I think, responding to, from an apologetic viewpoint, the attitude within secular sciences that tends to dismiss the soul. So that would be a similar book if someone's really wanting to research this beyond this one book. Okay. Worth checking out.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and sharing this book by Mark Cosgrove, The Brain, the Mind, and the Person Within. And thank you for joining us. And I trust that maybe this book and this interview may have spurred your interest in maybe exploring our mind and reading this book. But in the meantime, I trust that you may walk with the King and be a blessing to all those who cross your path. Thank you.